There is a particular kind of discomfort that arrives quietly, without warning, in the middle of otherwise ordinary moments. You are at a family gathering, a birthday, a holiday, a Sunday dinner, and the table is full. Familiar faces, people you love, food that smells like memory. And yet, somewhere in the middle of it, you notice that several people are looking at their phones. Not because something urgent has happened. Not because they are waiting for important news. Just because the phone is there, and the habit is strong, and the room, for some reason that nobody has named, does not feel like quite enough to hold their full attention. You notice it, you feel it, but you say nothing, because it would sound ungrateful, or irritable, or old. Or perhaps it happens at a different moment. You are watching a documentary, something serious, something about history or poverty or the natural world. And somewhere in the first 15 minutes, you realize you cannot tell whether you are watching journalism or a very elaborate advertisement. The lighting is too beautiful. The narrator's voice is too perfectly tuned for feeling. The way the story builds toward its conclusion is too deliberate, too tested, too optimized for something. You keep watching, but something in you has quietly disengaged. Or maybe it happens at a restaurant. You watch someone at the next table arrange their plate, hold up a phone, take 12 photos, delete 9, adjust the angle, take 4 more, choose one, and then, only then, begin to eat. And you think, why? What is the photo for? Who is the audience? What happens when the meal has been documented? Is it eaten, or was it always really just content? These moments do not feel like crises. They are too quiet for that. They feel more like small fractures, tiny gaps between what the world is and what it seems like it should be. Between what is happening and what it feels like to actually be there. This video is about that feeling. It is a feeling that many people carry but rarely find words for. It goes by different names depending on who you ask. Some people call it disconnection. Some call it numbness. Some say they feel like they are watching their own life from a slight distance, as if the camera is always on, as if everything is always already being performed for some invisible audience. What I want to suggest today is that this feeling is not confusion. It is not a sign of depression, or aging, or being out of touch. It is, in fact, a very reasonable response to something real that has happened in the world. A shift so gradual that it crept in through the edges of ordinary life without anyone fully deciding to let it through. The world has changed in a particular way over the last several decades. Not all at once, and not in ways that are easy to point at directly. But layer by layer, decade by decade, something that used to be assumed, the sense that what we see is what it is, that people are who they appear to be, that the moment we are in is actually happening, fully, without an audience, without a performance. That assumption has slowly eroded. And the people who feel this most acutely are not the ones who are confused about the world. They are the ones who are old enough to remember what it felt like before. I am not going to tell you that everything was better before. That would not be honest, and it would not be useful. Every era has its own forms of pretense, its own distances between surface and depth. But something did change, something structural, something built into the technology and the economics of modern attention, that made the performance visible in a way it had not been before. That made it harder to step outside of it, even for a moment. Today, we are going to look at what changed, and why it happened, and what it costs ordinary people to live inside it. And then, toward the end, we are going to talk about what, if anything, still feels real, because not everything has been curated. Not everything has been optimized. And those moments, small and unremarkable as they sometimes are, turn out to matter more than we might expect. But first, let us name the feeling more precisely. Because part of what makes it so difficult to talk about is that it does not arrive as one large loss. It arrives as an accumulation of small, strange moments in which the gap between experience and the representation of experience becomes briefly visible, and then closes again before you can quite decide what you saw. You have probably had these moments. The conversation with a customer service system so sophisticated that it takes you 10 minutes to realize you are not talking to a person. The news segment that looks identical to the advertisement that runs before it. The politician whose outrage is so perfectly calibrated, whose pause is so exactly placed, that you cannot tell whether they believe what they are saying or whether they have simply stopped distinguishing between the two. The photo of the holiday that you took not because you wanted to look at it later, but because the holiday did not feel quite real without documentation. None of these things, on their own, would be enough to carry the weight of a long conversation. But together, across years, they add up to something. They add up to a world that feels as though it is always, in some subtle way, performing itself. And that feeling, quiet, persistent, hard to name, is what we are going to try to understand today. It is worth trying to trace how we arrived here, not to assign blame, and not to pretend there is a single cause, but because the history matters. Because when you understand how the performance entered the world, the feeling of unreality starts to make a different kind of sense. The story does not begin with the internet, although the internet accelerated it. It begins earlier, in the middle of the 20th century, when television became the dominant medium of daily life. Television, at its best, was a genuine window. It showed people things they had never seen, places, events, faces, ideas. It connected dispersed communities to a shared experience. It was imperfect, limited, and often manipulated, but at its core it operated on the assumption that the world it was showing you was, in some basic sense, real. That assumption held for a while. But gradually, over the decades, something shifted. Television learned that it could not simply show the world as it was. It had to package the world in a form that would hold attention. The competition for that attention became more intense, the packaging became more deliberate, and the distance between the event and its representation quietly expanded. By the 1980s, the news had begun to absorb the rhythms of entertainment. Stories were chosen not only because they were important but because they were visual, immediate, and emotionally legible. The anchor's expression told you how to feel before the facts did. The music underneath the footage told you this was serious, or this was hopeful, or this was something to fear. The world was still there, but it was arriving pre-interpreted, pre-packaged, and pre-emoted. By the 1990s, the word reality had been attached to a genre of television that was, in fact, one of the most carefully manufactured things on screen. Reality television did not show you reality. It showed you people performing their own lives under controlled conditions, with edited results, for an audience. But it called itself reality, and over time, that language changed something in the culture, not because people believed it literally, but because the constant use of the word began to blur the line between the two. Performance and reality became harder to distinguish, and a generation grew up watching the blur and absorbing it as normal. And then came the internet. And then came social media. Social media did something no previous technology had done. It gave everyone a platform and, along with the platform, a quiet expectation of performance. The logic of the medium was simple: share your life, receive attention. But the consequence was subtler and more far-reaching than anyone anticipated. People began to relate to their own experiences not only as things to be lived, but as things to be documented, shared, and evaluated. The meal existed twice. Once when it was eaten, and once when it was photographed and posted and responded to. The holiday existed in two versions: the one you were present for, and the one you produced for an audience. And the second version, being more durable and more visible, began to carry more weight than the first. This is not a criticism of individuals. It is a description of an incentive structure. When an environment rewards performance, people perform. When attention flows toward the curated version of life, the unfiltered version starts to feel insufficient. Gradually, almost without noticing, you begin to look at your own experience through the lens of how it might be received, even when there is no audience, even when no one is watching. The algorithm deepened this further. Because algorithms are not neutral, they are optimization machines. They optimize for whatever maximizes engagement: outrage, beauty, novelty, fear, desire. The content that rises to the top is the content that has been tuned, consciously or unconsciously, to produce a reaction. Which means that the most visible, most shared, most recommended version of almost everything, news, politics, health advice, personal testimony, grief, joy, is the version that has been shaped by its own viral potential. The original impulse has been filtered out. What remains is the performance of the original. And now we have something newer still, content that was never organic to begin with. Text written by machines, images generated without a photographer, voices that belong to no one. The simulation has completed another loop. And the result, for anyone paying attention, is a world in which the question of what is genuine, what was actually made by a human being, actually lived through, actually felt, has become genuinely difficult to answer. This is not a conspiracy. No single company or person planned this outcome. It is the accumulated logic of 100 different incentive structures, all pointing in the same direction, toward the representation and away from the thing being represented. Toward the version of the experience that can be packaged, shared, and monetized, and away from the version that cannot. And it affects everything, not just entertainment. Politics has become performance, not recently, but progressively and more completely than before. Relationships are curated. Grief is shared according to its legibility. Rebellion itself is optimized for virality. Even the industries that exist to help people feel more alive, travel, wellness, spirituality, have been packaged and replicated until they, too, feel like content rather than experience. The experience economy is perhaps the most revealing symptom of all of this. An entire industry now exists to sell people the feeling of being genuinely alive. Immersive events, wilderness retreats, artisanal dinners, curated adventures. People pay significant amounts of money for experiences that promise to be unscripted, authentic, and real. The industry exists precisely because genuine unmediated experience has become rare enough to be marketed as a luxury. That is not a small thing to absorb. When realness becomes a product, something has shifted in the very foundation of daily life. What does all of this mean in practice, in the daily lives of ordinary people who did not ask to live inside a performance and who may not have the language to describe exactly what they are feeling? It means something that is difficult to articulate but easy to recognize once you have felt it. The experience of being present in body while absent in another, harder to name way. The sensation of being in a room full of people who are simultaneously elsewhere. The peculiar loneliness of a world that is noisier than ever but less genuinely connected than it used to be. Consider what happens at a family gathering now compared to what happened 30 years ago. The people are the same. The food may be similar. The occasion is the same. But the texture of the room has changed. There are more screens, more half-conversations that pause when a notification arrives and do not quite resume at the same depth. More documentation. Someone is almost always capturing the moment rather than simply being inside it, which is a generous impulse and also, in some quiet way, a form of absence. The moment is being preserved while it is still happening, which means the person doing the preserving is not entirely there for it. For older adults, people in their 60s and 70s who grew up in a world without smartphones, who learned to socialize in rooms where the only thing competing for attention was other people. This change is felt as a specific kind of disorientation. They remember what undivided presence felt like. They remember conversations that started, wandered, deepened, and ended without interruption. They remember silence at a table that was comfortable rather than filled. And they find themselves in a world that considers that kind of presence optional, or even slightly odd. There is a particular exhaustion in being the person in the room who is fully there when most of the room is partly elsewhere. It is not that anyone has done something wrong. It is simply that the environment now defaults to distraction, and choosing presence requires constant effort. For someone who grew up with presence as the default, this feels like the world has been rearranged around a value they do not share and were not asked about. The performance extends inward, too. People perform not only for others but for themselves. The internal voice that narrates, judges, and curates one's own experience. That voice has grown louder in an era of constant self-documentation. People caption their own moods. They compose their grief into shareable statements. They look for the angle in their own pain, the way it might be received, whether it is legible enough for an audience that is not even there. This creates a strange kind of distance from one's own experience. Not a dramatic estrangement, not a breakdown or a crisis, but the persistent background sensation that you are watching yourself as much as living. That your feelings are always slightly edited before they fully arrive. And then there is the toll it takes on the simplest things. The meal that used to be just a meal is now an opportunity. The holiday that used to be a rest is now content to be produced. The walk in the park used to require nothing of you. Now, depending on who you are and what habits you carry, it may feel like something that should be photographed, posted, or at least worth mentioning. The quiet accumulation of these small performances, none of them individually significant, each of them mildly depleting, adds up to a kind of tiredness that is hard to explain. You have been nowhere extraordinary. You have done nothing dramatic. And yet you are tired, in a way that sleep does not entirely fix. For people who are already dealing with the losses that come naturally in the second half of life, the retirement, the children who have grown and moved away, the friends whose health or distance has thinned the social world, this additional layer of unreality carries a particular weight. The world they are living in is already different from the one they built their lives inside. The family is more scattered, the community is more dispersed, the institutions they trusted have become less trustworthy. And now the texture of daily interaction itself has changed, become more performed, more mediated, more distant. The result, for many people, is not a dramatic crisis. It is a quieter thing, a persistent sense of displacement, of having stayed in one place while the world moved around them, of knowing, somewhere in the body, that something has been lost, but finding the loss too diffuse and too widely distributed to point it directly. That feeling is real, and it is worth more than a dismissal. Let us try to go a little deeper, because the feeling deserves more than a description of its symptoms. There is a philosopher's question underneath all of this, and it goes something like this. What makes an experience feel real? Not real in the sense of factually occurring. Obviously your dinner is factually occurring, your holiday factually happened, your conversation genuinely took place. But real in the sense of felt, lived, fully inhabited. What makes some moments feel saturated with presence, and others feel thin, like a copy of what an experience should be? It is worth spending some time on this question, because the answer tells us something important about why the modern world produces so much unreality despite being so full of stimulation. An experience feels real when it has certain qualities that are very difficult to manufacture. Presence, first, the sense that you are fully inside the moment rather than observing it from a slight distance. Risk, the awareness that what is happening has stakes, that the outcome is not controlled, that something genuine could be lost or gained. Impermanence, the knowledge that this moment will pass and cannot be retrieved, that its value lies partly in its fragility. And the absence of an audience, the freedom to be inside an experience without simultaneously performing it for anyone, including yourself. These four qualities, presence, risk, impermanence, and the absence of an audience, are exactly what the modern environment is structurally designed to reduce. The algorithm eliminates risk by giving you what you already want. The social media platform eliminates the absence of an audience by making one perpetually available. The notification eliminates presence by making distraction the default. And the photograph, the beloved, compulsive photograph, does something subtle and devastating to impermanence. It promises that you can hold the moment, that it will not slip away, that you can return to it, share it, and watch it accumulate meaning through the responses of others. But the promise is a kind of trick, because the photograph does not capture the moment. It captures the surface of the moment, the version that could be seen from outside. And while you were arranging the photograph, the inside of the moment was happening without you. The smell, the warmth, the quality of the light on someone's face, the feeling in your own body, These things did not wait. They passed, and you were, for those seconds, producing content rather than living. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description of a mechanism, and it operates whether you are aware of it or not. What has happened, over decades of this mechanism operating at scale, is that the culture has slowly lost its fluency in genuine experience. Not completely, not irreversibly, but measurably. People report higher levels of loneliness despite having more social connection than any previous era. They report less satisfaction with leisure despite having more of it. They feel that time passes faster but also emptier. They feel, in other words, like they are consuming a great deal of life without absorbing very much of it. The word, authenticity, is everywhere now. On brand labels, in marketing campaigns, in the language of politicians and public figures trying to position themselves as trustworthy. But the very ubiquity of the word is part of the problem. Authenticity that is performed ceases to be authentic. The moment you begin to produce your own genuineness for an audience, you have left the territory the word describes. And yet the demand for it, the hunger for something that feels real, is so acute that even a simulation of authenticity carries enormous commercial and political value. There is a deeper paradox here that is worth naming. The more the culture is saturated with performance, the more people crave experiences that feel unperformed. And the more they crave those experiences, the larger the market becomes for selling them simulated unperformedness. Retreats that promise disconnection, but require booking and a curated itinerary. Restaurants that promise the feeling of your grandmother's kitchen, but have been designed by a consulting firm. Travel experiences advertised as off the beaten path, but sold in packages and posted to Instagram by thousands of people every year. This is not hypocrisy. It is a structural trap. When the hunger for the real is real, but the infrastructure for providing it has been built by the same forces that made it rare, you end up with an endless loop. The cure is sold by the same economy that produced the disease. None of this means that technology is inherently evil, or that progress is a mistake, or that we should be trying to return to some earlier and simpler time. It means only this: that human beings are creatures of presence, risk, impermanence, and privacy. These are not preferences or tastes. They are structural requirements of the kind of experience that human minds are built to absorb as real. And the modern world, for very understandable economic and technological reasons, has systematically reduced all four. The result is a population that is, in some diffuse and hard-to-name way, hungry. Not for content. There is more content available than any person could absorb in 100 lifetimes. Hungry for experience that lands. For the moment that feels genuinely inhabited. For the conversation that goes somewhere neither person planned. For the room where everyone is actually there. That hunger is not a weakness. It is not nostalgia. It is not evidence of failing to adapt to the modern world. It is evidence that something in us has not been entirely domesticated by the infrastructure of performance, and that something is one of the most important things we have. There are things that cannot be curated. Physical pain, for one. Not the performance of pain. Not the carefully worded social media post about chronic illness. Not the vulnerability managed for an audience. But the actual sensation, arriving in your body at 3 in the morning, which belongs to no one else and can be shared with no one entirely. Pain is private in a way that almost nothing else is. It happens inside you, without an audience, without a filter, without optimization. It is, in that sense, completely real. So is genuine laughter. The kind that arrives before you can decide whether it is appropriate, that comes from a part of you that was not prepared, that sometimes embarrasses you because it was too large, too honest, too unmanaged. Not the performed laugh for the camera. The one that escapes before the performance can start. So is grief. Not the public version of grief, which has its protocols and its social shapes, but the private version. The grief that arrives at unexpected moments, when you catch a smell or a quality of light that belongs to someone who is no longer here. That grief is not legible to anyone else. It does not translate into content. It is yours alone, and it is very real. So is the smell of rain. The weight of a hand on your shoulder at the right moment. The taste of food made by someone who loves you and wants nothing back for it. The silence of an early morning before the rest of the house wakes up. The moment in a long conversation when something shifts and you can feel that the other person has stopped performing and started actually being there. When the voice changes slightly, when the eyes stop moving around the room, when both of you are suddenly in the same place at the same time. These moments exist everywhere. They are not in the past. They are not available only in childhood or in some simpler era. They are available today, this week, possibly this evening, if you are willing to do the one thing the modern environment works hardest against, which is to stop performing, even briefly, even for yourself. That is easier said than done. The habit of narration is strong. The phone is always nearby. The gap between living a moment and producing the moment has been shrinking for so long that many people no longer feel the gap at all. They have adapted, almost entirely, to a world in which experience and the documentation of experience have merged. And that adaptation is not failure. It is a reasonable response to an environment that rewards it. But the hunger for the real persists. It persists because the deep animal in us, the part that needs presence, risk, impermanence, and privacy, has not evolved fast enough to stop wanting what it has always needed. The hunger is quieter now, for many people. It has learned to wait. It surfaces in the feeling that something is slightly off, in the gaps between moments, in the strange flatness that can arrive after a day full of stimulation. The fact that you feel the unreality is not a problem to be solved. It is a form of clarity. It means that somewhere in you, the distinction between presence and performance is still legible. You have not entirely adjusted to a world that treats the two as equivalent. You still notice the difference. And noticing the difference is not nothing. It is the beginning of something. The goal is not to retreat from the modern world. That is not possible and probably not desirable. The goal is not to become suspicious of everything, or to perform your own authenticity so loudly that it becomes its own kind of curation. The goal is quieter than that. It is to notice, more often, when you are actually inside your life rather than producing it. To let some moments pass without documentation, without sharing, without the internal voice already composing the caption. To allow some conversations to go somewhere unexpected, without directing them toward a conclusion that will be easy to remember. To let yourself be surprised. To let the moment be fragile, and unrecorded, and entirely yours. There is no method to optimize here. There is no system to buy into. There is just the decision, made again and again in small and unremarkable moments, to be where you are. Maybe that is the simplest thing this video can offer. Not a solution to the unreality of the modern world. That is a structural condition that no individual decision can undo entirely. But the reminder that reality has not disappeared. It is still there, in the unoptimized gaps. In the moments between the performance. In the things that have never been possible to photograph in a way that captures what they actually are. The fact that you can still feel the difference, that the world's unreality still registers as loss rather than as normal, is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something in you is still working exactly as it should.